Snow didn't just fall, it sand-blasted the siding off Mavis's cabin. 9 frozen, leather-clad giants stood on her porch, smelling of exhaust, cheap bourbon, and impending death. These weren't choir boys. They wore the death's head patches of the Hells Angels, their frozen beards dripping onto her warped floorboards. A sensible woman would have locked the deadbolt and prayed. Mavis just gripped her shotgun with arthritic fingers, sighed at the pooling water, and told them to wipe their damn boots. Wind did not whistle through the valley tonight. It screamed. It was a jagged, tearing sound that made the old pine joists of Mavis's cabin groan in protest. The temperature had dropped 30 degrees in 2 hours, transforming a heavy snowfall into a blinding whiteout that erased the road, the trees, and the property line. Inside, Mavis sat in her wingback chair, nursing a mug of chicory coffee that had gone tepid 10 minutes ago. She was 72, entirely alone, and her left knee was broadcasting the barometric pressure with dull, rhythmic spikes of agony. The cabin smelled of wood smoke, old paperbacks, and the sharp medicinal tang of the liniment she'd rubbed into her joints. She wasn't frightened of the storm. She was annoyed. Storms meant drafts. Drafts meant chopping more wood, and chopping wood meant her shoulders would ache for a week. She pulled a moth-eaten wool blanket higher around her neck. The local radio station had faded into static an hour ago, leaving only the aggressive rattle of the window panes for company. Then, beneath the shriek of the wind, she felt a vibration. It wasn't thunder. It was mechanical, deep, guttural, and sputtering. It felt like an earthquake localized entirely to her front yard. Engines, big ones. Mavis frowned, the deep lines around her mouth deepening into trenches. No one in their right mind was out on County Road 9 tonight. The plows had stopped running at dusk. Whoever was out there was either catastrophically lost or profoundly stupid. She leaned forward, the joints in her spine popping in sequence, and listened. The heavy, throbbing hum choked, sputtered, and died. One by one, multiple engines coughed into silence. Then came the voices. Muffled shouts snatched away by the gale, the crunch of heavy boots punching through waist-deep drifts. Mavis didn't panic. Panic was a luxury for people who hadn't lived through 3 husbands and a recession. Instead, she stood up a slow and deliberate process and walked to the hallway closet. Her fingers, gnarled and thick at the knuckles, closed around the cold, oiled steel of a pump-action 12-gauge. She checked the safety. It was off. Heavy footfalls hit her porch. The wood groaned under immense weight. Not one person, several. Thud, thud, thud. A fist hammered against her solid oak front door. It sounded desperate. Mavis approached the door, her slippers shuffling against the worn linoleum. She didn't look through the peephole. Her eyes weren't what they used to be, and the glass was likely frosted over anyway. She stood a foot back from the heavy wood, leveled the barrel of the shotgun at chest height, and waited. "Open up, please. We got a guy going down out here." The voice was raw, tearing at the vocal cords, panic bleeding through the thick timber of a grown man's chest. Mavis hesitated. The world was full of monsters. She read the papers. She knew what happened to old women living alone in the woods, but she also knew what 20 below zero did to human flesh. She'd seen a calf freeze solid, standing up in the blizzard of '88. She exhaled a breath she didn't realize she was holding, lowered the barrel slightly, and threw the deadbolt. The wind tore the door from her grip, slamming it against the interior wall with a violent crack. Snow billowed into the hallway, a chaotic swirl of white that coated the rug instantly. Filling the doorframe was a wall of black leather, wet denim, and ice. There were 9 of them. Massive men built like bricklayers and bar brawlers. Their heavy leather cuts were plastered with snow, but the winged death's head patches on their chests and backs were starkly visible. Hell's Angels. The man at the front, who looked to be pushing 50 with a tangled gray beard frozen solid to his chest, had his arm wrapped around a younger, much thinner man whose lips were the color of bruised plums. The younger man wasn't shivering anymore. That was the bad stage. They looked at the shotgun in her hands. She looked at the ice forming on their eyelashes. "Ma'am," the bearded man rasped, his teeth chattering so violently he could barely form the word. "We lost the road. Bikes are dead. He's dying. Mavis didn't see bikers. She didn't see the notorious gang from the news. She saw a mess she was going to have to mop up, and she saw idiot boys who hadn't checked the damn weather report. She felt a profound wave of exhaustion wash over her. If she slammed the door, they would be dead by morning. The sheriff would have to come out. There would be questions. Yellow tape on her porch. It would completely ruin her Tuesday. "Don't just stand there letting the heat out." Mavis snapped, her voice cutting through the wind like a rusted razor blade. She stepped back, gesturing with the barrel of the shotgun. "Get in here and wipe your damn boots. I just scrubbed that floor." The bearded man blinked, bewildered, but the survival instinct overrode his pride. He hauled the younger biker over the threshold, the rest of the hulking pack crowding in behind him, bringing the bitter, biting stench of the storm inside with them. Mavis used her hip to shove the heavy door closed against the gale, throwing the deadbolt with a resounding click that echoed like a gunshot in the suddenly cramped hallway. She was locked in with 9 Hell's Angels, and she was already furious about the puddles forming on her rug. The hallway suddenly felt the size of a shoebox. 9 men, most of them easily clearing 6 feet and 200 pounds, were packed shoulder to shoulder, dripping melting snow onto the linoleum. The air instantly thickened with their scent, a suffocating mix of wet animal hide, unwashed hair, stale cigarette smoke, and the sharp metallic tang of cold exhaust. Mavis stood at the end of the hall, the shotgun now resting barrel up against her shoulder. Her arms were too tired to keep it leveled. "Take the leather off," she barked. "You can't warm up if you're wearing an icebox. Pile it by the door. Do not put it on the radiator. It'll ruin the leather and it'll make my house smell like a wet dog." The men stared at her. For a second, the natural order of their world clashed violently with the reality of this tiny, frowning old woman. Bikers didn't just take off their cuts for anyone. It was their skin, their identity. The bearded man, who had a patch reading "Bear" over his left breast, nodded slowly. He unbuttoned his stiff frozen vest and let it drop to the floor. The heavy thud of the damp leather was a signal. The others followed suit, a chorus of heavy zippers and snapping buttons. "Get him to the rug by the wood stove." Mavis pointed to the younger man, who was now slumping against the wall, his eyes half closed and unfocused. "Not on the sofa. That sofa is older than you are, and I don't want melted snow in the cushions." Bear and another biker, a bald giant with a spiderweb tattooed across his throat, hauled the kid into the living room. They laid him down on the braided rag rug in front of the cast-iron stove. The heat in the room was oppressive near the fire, but the kid didn't even flinch. Mavis leaned the shotgun against the umbrella stand. She was taking a gamble, and she knew it. But holding a gun on freezing men was exhausting, and her knees were screaming. If they were going to kill her, they'd just have to do it. She had a pot of coffee to make. She limped into the kitchen. The linoleum felt cold through her thin slippers. She could hear the low, rumbling murmurs of the men in her living room, the sound of heavy boots scraping awkwardly against the floorboards. She grabbed her largest aluminum percolator, filled it with water, and dumped in 4 heaping scoops of cheap acidic grounds. When she carried the tray of mismatched mugs into the living room, the sheer scale of the intrusion hit her again. Her cozy, meticulously tidy space was overrun. Bikers were sitting on the floor, leaning against the walls, wrapping their massive tattooed arms around their shivering torsos. They looked like beaten dogs. She walked over to the kid by the fire. He was violently trembling now. Good. That meant his core temperature was rising. Mavis kicked Bear lightly in the shin. He flinched, looking up at her from where he sat on the floor. "He needs wet heat, not dry heat," Mavis said, her tone devoid of sympathy. "The stove will just burn his skin before it warms his blood. Go to the bathroom. End of the hall. Under the sink there's a red-hot water bottle. Fill it from the tap. Hottest it goes." Bear scrambled to his feet, a towering behemoth of a man taking orders from a woman who barely reached his breastbone. "Yes, ma'am." She handed out the mugs in silence. None of the men spoke. They took the scalding black coffee with trembling, calloused hands, wrapping their thick fingers around the porcelain to steal the heat. One of them, a blond man with a jagged scar running through his eyebrow, whispered a ragged, "Thank you." Mavis just grunted. She went to the hall closet and began pulling down blankets. She didn't have heavy sleeping bags. She had Afghans, pastel pink crochet mint green floral quilts, and a hideous neon orange throw her sister had knitted in the 90s. She tossed them into the center of the room. "Wrap up," she ordered. Within 5 minutes, the menacing presence of the Hells Angels was completely neutralized by Mavis's interior decorating. 9 hardened outlaws were huddled around her wood stove, shivering uncontrollably while draped in crocheted pink daisies and mint green tulips. Mavis finally sat down in her wingback chair. She pulled her own blanket tight. The shotgun was still in the hallway. She looked at the men, and they looked at her. The silence was thick-heavy with unasked questions and lingering adrenaline. Bear walked back into the room holding the red rubber hot water bottle. He crouched by the younger kid, slipping it under his flannel shirt against his chest. "We owe you, ma'am." Bear said, his voice a low gravel. The shivering had subsided enough for him to speak clearly. "We wouldn't have made it. Bikes stalled out. Carburetors froze." Mavis stared at him, her dark eyes utterly unimpressed. "I don't want your gratitude. I want you to be quiet. My programs are off, the radio is dead, and my head is pounding. You stay on the floor. You don't touch the thermostat. And if any of you break my mother's china in that cabinet, I'll shoot you myself and throw you back out in the snow." A beat of silence passed. Then the bald man with the spiderweb tattoo let out a short, rough bark of laughter. Bear glared at him, shutting it down instantly. "Understood," Bear said softly. Mavis closed her eyes. The wind outside continued to batter the siding, but inside, the only sound was the crackle of the wood logs, the ticking of the grandfather clock, and the heavy, ragged breathing of 9 men who had just barely cheated death. It was going to be a very, very long night. Hours stretched into a stagnant, suffocating eternity. Mavis did not sleep. She sat rigidly in her wingback chair, the worn floral upholstery pressing against her aching spine. Her right hand remained draped over the armrest, her knuckles resting inches from the heavy steel of a tire iron she'd quietly retrieved from the mudroom when Bear went to use the bathroom. Trust was a concept she reserved for her bank teller and her roofer. Men who wore skulls on their backs and carried the smell of stale beer and violence didn't qualify. The living room had transformed into a humid, foul-smelling infirmary. 9 large bodies generate a massive amount of radiant heat. Combined with the roaring cast-iron stove, the temperature in the cramped space had climbed uncomfortably high. The air was thick-tasting of drying wool, wet denim sweat, and the sour tang of adrenaline slowly leaching out of their pores. The windows were entirely opaque, frosted over from the inside due to the heavy condensation. Sleep claimed the men in stages. First went the kid on the rug. His violent shivering had tapered off into a deep, congested exhaustion. Bear had draped the neon orange Afghan over him, tucking the edges under his boots to trap the warmth. Then, the bald man with the spiderweb tattoo slumped against the wood box, his chin resting on his chest, emitting a low, whistling snore. One by one, the rest folded. They slept like stray dogs curled into tight protective balls backs against the walls, instinctively guarding their flanks even in unconsciousness. It was a jarring sight. These were men who thrived on intimidation, who commanded entire highways with noise and aggression. Now buried under Mavis's pastel crochet blankets, they looked reduced, small, mortal. Mavis shifted her left knee, popping loudly in the quiet room. The sound was sharp enough to make one of the men, a lanky fellow with a crooked nose, flinch in his sleep and throw an arm over his face. She watched the mantel clock. 3:14 a.m. The wind outside was still punishing the cabin, throwing solid sheets of ice against the eastern wall with a sound like handfuls of gravel scattered on tin. But inside, the rhythmic, heavy breathing of the bikers had become a hypnotic drone. Around 4 o'clock, a shadow detached itself from the wall near the hallway. Mavis's fingers tightened around the cold shaft of the tire iron. Her heart rate spiked, a sudden heavy thumping in her throat, but she kept her breathing perfectly even. It was a man they called Sullivan. He was built like a cinder block with a thick, unbroken line of a unibrow and a jagged scar cutting through his upper lip. He moved with agonizing slowness, trying not to step on the outstretched legs of his sleeping brothers. He paused, looking toward Mavis's chair. In the dim orange glow of the wood stove embers, she stared back. Her eyes were hard, unblinking. Sullivan held up his hands palms facing her, a universal gesture of surrender. He pointed a thick, grease-stained finger toward his dry lips, then gestured vaguely toward the kitchen. Mavis didn't speak. She just gave a single curt nod. She listened to his heavy stockinged feet pad across the linoleum. The pipes groaned as he turned on the kitchen tap. He drank loudly, slurping the water with desperate gulps. Mavis stood up, the joints in her hips locking in protest, and silently followed him to the kitchen doorway. Sullivan had a chipped jelly jar in his hand, leaning against her Formica counter in the dark. He looked exhausted. The deep creases around his eyes were caked with dirt and soot. He saw her standing in the doorway and stiffened slightly. "Sorry," he mumbled, his voice a dry rasp. "Didn't mean to wake you." "I wasn't asleep," Mavis said flatly. Sullivan wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. He looked at the floor, then at the floral wallpaper peeling slightly near the ceiling. Kid's breathing easier, colors coming back to his hands. "Frostnip mostly. If he loses a toe, it's his own fault for wearing cheap boots in a blizzard," Mavis replied, her tone devoid of comfort. A ghost of a smile touched Sullivan's scarred lip. "Toby ain't exactly a seasoned rider. First big run. Wanted to prove he could hang with the pack. Stupid kid." "Stupidity is expensive. Usually costs a finger or a life," Mavis said, crossing her arms over her chest. "You all should know better. The radio warned about this front 2 days ago. We thought we could beat it, outrun it to the state line," Sullivan admitted, staring down at the empty jelly jar. "Arrogance. Bear pushed us hard. We hit black ice on the county road. 2 bikes went down into the ditch. Toby got pinned under an exhaust pipe. By the time we dug him out, the storm swallowed us. Couldn't see 10 feet. He paused, swallowing hard. "We were walking for 2 hours. I couldn't feel my legs anymore. If we hadn't smelled your chimney smoke." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Mavis looked at him. Strip away the leather, the tattoos, and the menacing posture, and he was just a tired man who had looked death in the eye and blinked. She felt a brief, irritating flicker of empathy. She squashed it immediately. Empathy led to making sandwiches, and she wasn't running a diner. "Put the glass in the sink," Mavis ordered, "and don't step on my rug with those wet socks when you go back in there. Walk on the edges." Sullivan carefully set the glass down. "Yes, ma'am." He hesitated before walking past her. "You got guts, lady. Most folks would have let us freeze." "I don't like dead bodies on my property. They ruin the grass," Mavis said. Sullivan chuckled softly, a dry, rattling sound. He ambled back into the living room, gingerly navigating the maze of sleeping giants. Mavis stayed in the kitchen for a long moment, staring out the window into the pitch-black, swirling void. The draft from the glass seeped through her wool sweater, biting at her collarbone. She checked the back door lock out of sheer habit, then walked back to her chair, sitting down to wait for the dawn. Dawn arrived not with sunlight, but with a slow, creeping dilution of the darkness. The pitch-black windows shifted to a bruised, sickly gray. The screaming wind had finally exhausted itself, replaced by an eerie, suffocating silence. Mavis opened her eyes. She hadn't realized she'd dozed off until the sharp stabbing pain in her neck woke her. Her head had slumped against the wing of the chair. She groaned softly, pressing the heel of her hand against her stiff vertebrae. The air in the living room was stale and heavy. The fire had burned down to white ash and faint glowing embers. The 9 men were still exactly where they had fallen, a tangled knot of limbs, leather boots, and pastel yarn. Mavis stood up, refusing to limp, though her knee felt like it was packed with ground glass. She walked to the front window and pulled back the heavy curtain. The snow was banked halfway up the glass. The porch was entirely gone, replaced by a smooth, wind-sculpted dune of white that seamlessly connected the roofline to the yard. The pine trees at the edge of her property were bowed entirely in half under the weight of the ice. The road didn't exist. The world had simply stopped. "Well," Mavis muttered to the empty glass, "that's a mess." She turned toward the kitchen. Her stomach gave a hollow, acidic rumble. She operated on a strict schedule, and 6:30 a.m. meant coffee and breakfast. The fact that she was currently housing a motorcycle gang did not excuse a break in routine. She turned on the harsh fluorescent overhead light in the kitchen, deliberately making enough noise to wake the dead. She slammed the heavy cast-iron skillet onto the front burner. She opened the refrigerator, the compressor humming loudly, and pulled out 2 thick packages of thick-cut bacon, a carton of eggs, and a half-loaf of stale sourdough. The smell of sizzling bacon grease is a universal alarm clock. Within 10 minutes, the low, congested groans of waking men drifted from the living room. Mavis didn't look up from the stove. She methodically flipped the bacon with a long wooden fork, letting the grease pop and spit against the stovetop. Bear appeared in the kitchen doorway first. He looked terrible. His thick gray beard was violently crinkled from sleeping against the floorboards, and his eyes were bloodshot. He stood there, a towering mass of muscle, looking entirely unsure of what to do with his hands. "Morning." Bear grunted, his voice thick with sleep and dehydration. "There's instant coffee in the blue tin on the counter. Cups are in the strainer. Don't use the red mug the handle is glued on." Mavis instructed, not taking her eyes off the popping fat. Bear moved to the counter with surprising meekness. He filled a mug from the kettle she'd left simmering. Slowly, the others began to shuffle in. They moved like battered prize fighters. Sullivan was rubbing a severe crick in his neck. The bald man was stretching his massive arms, wincing as his joints popped. Toby the kid, who had nearly frozen to death, leaned heavily against the door frame. He was pale, and his hands were wrapped in a spare pink towel, but his eyes were clear. They crowded into her tiny, yellow wallpapered kitchen, drawn by the heat and the overpowering smell of food. Mavis cracked 18 eggs into a massive glass bowl, whisking them violently with a fork. "I don't run a bed and breakfast," Mavis said loudly over the sizzle of the pan. "I don't have enough chairs. You'll eat standing up or you'll sit on the floor. Plates are in the cabinet behind you. Sullivan, grab them." The men scrambled to obey. It was a bizarre choreography. These hardened criminals, men who lived outside the law, were tiptoeing around Mavis's linoleum, terrified of bumping into her ceramic rooster collection. Mavis dumped the eggs into the hot grease left over from the bacon. They began to scramble instantly, puffing up into thick yellow clouds. She piled the mountain of eggs and the crispy bacon onto a large serving platter and shoved it into the center of the small dinette table. "Eat," she ordered. They descended on the food like starving wolves, but with a strange, restrained politeness. Nobody pushed, nobody cursed. They shoveled the eggs and bacon onto their plates, eating in silence, standing shoulder to shoulder in the cramped space. Toby ate slowly, his hands shaking slightly as he held the fork. Bear chewed a piece of sourdough, watching Mavis as she poured herself a small, bitter cup of black coffee. "Storms broke," Bear said, gesturing with his chin toward the window. "I have eyes," Mavis replied. She took a sip of her coffee. "Snow is packed tight. County won't get a plow out here until tomorrow at the earliest. They prioritize the main highways. You're stuck." A collective groan rippled through the kitchen. The men looked out the window at the towering drifts. Their bikes were buried out there somewhere, likely encased in solid blocks of ice. "We can dig out the porch, see if we can clear a path to the road." Bear offered, wiping grease from his beard with a paper towel. "Can't just sit here?" "You don't have shovels," Mavis pointed out, "and I only have one. It's in the mudroom. You'll take turns, and you won't throw the snow against the foundation. It'll flood the basement when it melts. Toss it over the railing into the yard." "Yes, ma'am," Bear said. He looked around the kitchen, noting the grease splatters on the stove and the sink full of dirty dishes. "We'll clean this up. You cooked, we wash." Mavis almost argued. She hated people touching her things. They always put the spatulas in the wrong drawer. But she was exhausted. Her bones felt heavy, filled with lead and cold dampness. "Fine," Mavis snapped. "Sponge is under the sink. Use the hot water. Don't use too much dish soap. It takes forever to rinse." She turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving the platter of scraps and the dirty pans. She walked back into the living room. The pastel blankets were already neatly folded in a stack on her sofa. Someone had even swept the ash back into the wood stove and loaded 3 fresh logs onto the fire. Mavis stood in the center of the room, looking at the tidy stack of Afghans. A strange, unfamiliar pressure built up behind her ribs. It wasn't fear and it wasn't anger. It was a heavy, sinking realization that her solitary, perfectly ordered world had been entirely upended, and somehow the sky hadn't fallen. She lowered herself back into her wingback chair, closing her eyes as the sound of running water and gruff whispers echoed from her kitchen. Sunlight poured through the frosted living room windows, blinding and harsh, reflecting off a landscape that looked less like a front yard and more like the surface of a dead planet. Mavis sat in her chair, a fresh mug of black coffee warming her palm, watching the synchronized chaos unfolding on her porch. 9 men were sharing a single rusted aluminum snow shovel with a cracked wooden handle. They operated in shifts of brutal, exhausting rotation, necessitated by the biting cold and the sheer volume of packed snow. Bear would take the shovel his massive shoulders, rolling under a borrowed faded flannel shirt, and drive the metal edge into the dense drift. He'd heave a cubic foot of solid white over the porch railing, his breath pluming in thick clouds of steam. After 10 brutal minutes, he'd pass the shovel to the bald man, who would grunt, spit over the rail, and continue the assault. Mavis observed them with the critical eye of a foreman. They lacked technique. They were lifting with their backs, not their knees, relying entirely on brute upper body strength to muscle the snow away. It was inefficient, but it was effective. Slowly, agonizingly, the gray planks of her porch began to emerge from the ice. Behind her, the kitchen sink squeaked. She turned her head. Toby, the youngest, the one who had nearly died on a rug, was standing at the counter. He had insisted on finishing the dishes while the older men dug. His leathers were still draped over a kitchen chair, stiff and reeking of exhaust, so he wore only his thermal undershirt. He looked frail without the heavy biker armor. A sharp clatter of ceramic hitting aluminum echoed from the kitchen. Mavis sighed, pushing herself up from the chair. Her knees popped a sound, like dry twigs snapping underfoot. She shuffled into the kitchen. Toby was staring down into the sink, his thin shoulders hunched up to his ears. A white saucer sat chipped in the metal basin. "I'm sorry," Toby mumbled, his voice tight. He didn't look at her. "My fingers, they're clumsy today. I didn't mean to drop it." Mavis walked up beside him. She looked at his hands. The skin across his knuckles was a mottled, angry purple, fading into a sickly, waxy yellow at the fingertips. Frostnip had done its work. The nerves were misfiring, sending delayed signals to muscles that felt like they were packed with wet sand. "Step aside," Mavis said, her voice completely flat. Toby flinched, pulling his hands back against his chest like a scolded child. He stepped away from the sink, his eyes cast down at the faded linoleum. Mavis reached into the soapy water, retrieved the chipped saucer, and set it on the drying rack. She pulled the plug, letting the gray, greasy water drain away with a wet, slurping sound. She didn't yell. She didn't offer comfort. She simply dried her hands on a dish towel and opened the cabinet beneath the sink. She pulled out a dented green tin of bag balm. It was an old farmer's remedy meant for cow udders, but it worked miracles on cracked human skin. It smelled powerfully of lanolin and medical-grade antiseptic. "Sit down at the table," Mavis ordered. Toby hesitated, then sank into one of her spindly wooden chairs. Mavis pried the lid off the tin with her thumb. She scooped out a thick yellowish glob of the greasy ointment. "Give me your hands," she demanded. He slowly extended his arms. His fingers were trembling. Mavis grabbed his right hand. Her grip was surprisingly strong, her own joints swollen with arthritis, but she handled him with a rough clinical efficiency. She slapped the ointment onto his knuckles and began to work it into the damaged skin with her thumbs. Toby hissed a sharp intake of breath through his teeth. "Quiet!" Mavis snapped, though she didn't lighten her pressure. "It hurts because the blood is trying to find its way back into the capillaries. If you don't massage it, the skin will crack open tonight and you'll bleed all over my clean sheets." "We're sleeping on the floor," Toby corrected weakly. "You'll bleed on my floor then, which is worse." She kneaded the thick grease into the webs of his fingers. The harsh medicinal smell filled the small kitchen, overpowering the lingering scent of bacon grease. Toby watched her hands. Her skin was thin, translucent, mapped with blue veins and liver spots, yet she manipulated his swollen, bruised fingers with absolute authority. "Why'd you let us in?" Toby asked suddenly. The question hung in the air, heavy and unpolished. Mavis didn't look up from his cuticles. Because the ground is frozen. Digging a grave in February ruins the shovel. I'm serious. Toby pressed his voice, cracking slightly. We're Hell's Angels, lady. People cross the street when they see us. People lock their car doors. You had a shotgun. You could have just left us. Mavis finished his right hand and dropped it onto the table. She grabbed his left. I've lived in this woods for 40 years, Mavis said, her voice dropping into a low, steady cadence. I've buried 2 dogs, 3 husbands, and a daughter. I know what death smells like. I know what it looks like when it's standing on the front porch. She dug her thumbs into the base of his thumb, ignoring his wince. You boys didn't look like monsters last night. You looked like drowned rats. I don't turn away strays, even ugly ones. Toby stared at her. His eyes were watering, though whether from the pain in his hands or the shock of her bluntness, she didn't care. Besides, Mavis added, wiping the excess grease onto the dish towel, if you were going to rob me, you would have done it before you folded my Afghans. Keep your hands out of the hot water today. The nerves need to settle. She turned her back to him, putting the tin away. Outside, the rhythmic scrape of the shovel continued, a steady grating heartbeat against the overwhelming silence of the snow-drowned world. By 3 in the afternoon, the temperature inside the cabin began to drop. It wasn't a sudden plunge, but a creeping, insidious chill that seeped under the baseboards and settled around the ankles. The cast-iron stove was consuming wood at an alarming rate. Usually a single oak log would smolder for hours, keeping the small cabin at a tolerable, if brisk, 60 degrees. But with the front door opening and closing, as the men rotated shovel duty and the sheer volume of frozen air pressing against the glass, the stove was fighting a losing battle. Mavis sat by the hearth, poking at the dying embers with a blackened iron rod. The wood box, a sturdy pine crate her second husband had built, was nearly empty. 3 pieces of splintered birch and a handful of kindling remained. The front door opened, bringing a violent rush of Arctic air into the hallway. Bear stepped inside. He was panting, a thin layer of frost clinging to his beard and eyebrows. He kicked his heavy boots against the doorframe, knocking loose thick clumps of packed snow, then carefully shut the door, throwing the deadbolt. He walked into the living room, stripping off his wet leather gloves. He looked at the dying fire, then at the empty wood box. We're running low. Bear rumbled, his chest heaving. Mavis didn't look up. She tossed one of the birch logs onto the embers. It caught, immediately hissing as the sap boiled. There's a half-cord in the shed out back, but the door is frozen shut and the snow is waist-deep between here and there. Bear nodded slowly. He looked down at his raw, blistered hands. Digging out the porch had taken them 6 hours. They had cleared a path to the steps, revealing a trench that looked like a military bunker, but the bikes were still buried somewhere under the massive drift in the driveway. Where's the mall? Bear asked. Mavis turned her head. It's in the mudroom, but the wood in the shed isn't split. It's green oak rounds, heavy. I usually pay the miller boy down the road to split it in the spring. You can't burn it whole, it won't catch. We'll split it, Bear said simply. You're exhausted, Mavis pointed out, stating a clinical fact rather than offering sympathy. Your shoulders are shaking. You swing an 8-pound maul with tired arms. You're going to put it through your shin. I don't have enough bandages for that. Bear offered a grim, lopsided smile. Ma'am, with all due respect, I've swung chains heavier than that maul after being awake for 3 days. We need heat. You need heat. He turned and walked toward the mudroom. A minute later, he emerged with Sullivan. Sullivan was carrying the heavy, rust-pitted splitting maul, resting casually against his shoulder. Bear was carrying a coil of heavy rope he'd found in the closet. Mavis moved to the kitchen window that overlooked the backyard. She watched the 2 massive men wade into the unbroken snow. They didn't bother trying to shovel a path. They used their bodies as plows, Bear taking the lead, driving his thighs into the chest-high drift, breaking the crust, and pushing forward by sheer stubborn force. Sullivan followed in his wake. It took them 20 minutes just to reach the shed, a distance of maybe 40 feet. Mavis watched Bear kick the frozen door latch, once, twice, a third time, with a heavy, sickening thud of his steel-toe boot. The ice shattered, and the door groaned open. What followed was a display of physical violence that Mavis found entirely captivating. They didn't carry the heavy oak rounds back to the porch to split them. They worked in the snow. Bear hauled a massive 2-foot-thick round of green oak out of the shed, dropping it onto the packed snow. Sullivan stepped up, planted his boots wide, and raised the maul high over his head. Even through the double-paned glass, Mavis heard the sharp explosive crack. Sullivan didn't swing like a farmer. He swung like an executioner. The heavy wedge of the maul tore through the dense oak grain with terrifying velocity. The log split perfectly in half. Bear was immediately there, setting the halves upright. Sullivan swung again and again. The rhythm was hypnotic. Thwack, thwack, thwack. Mavis watched them for a long time. Her chest felt strangely tight. For 10 years, chopping wood had been the bane of her existence. It was a humiliating, painful reminder of her failing body. She would spend hours nicking away at smaller logs, her back screaming, her hands blistering, counting every piece because she couldn't afford to waste a single splinter. She lived in a constant state of rationing her money, rationing her food, rationing her own physical energy. These men did not ration. They consumed and they exerted in massive, overwhelming quantities. In less than an hour, a massive pile of freshly split oak lay in the snow. Bear tied the rope around bundles of the wood, creating makeshift sleds, and dragged them back through the trench they had carved. When they finally hauled the wood into the cabin, the smell of raw, wet oak filled the living room. It was a sharp, earthy scent that Mavis usually associated with the dread of impending winter. Today, it smelled like survival. They stacked the wood perfectly next to the stove, interlocking the pieces so the pile wouldn't shift. Bear opened the iron door of the stove and fed 3 thick wedges of oak into the flames. The fire roared to life, casting a deep orange glow across his sweating face. Sullivan dropped the maul by the front door and leaned against the wall, sliding down until he was sitting on the floor. He closed his eyes, his massive chest heaving. Mavis stood in the doorway of the living room. She looked at the towering stack of wood. It was enough to keep the cabin at 80 degrees for a week. "You tracked snow on the rug," Mavis said. Her voice was raspy. Bear looked down at his boots, then grabbed a rag off the mantel and immediately dropped to his knees to wipe up the melting puddles. Mavis turned away before he could see her face. She walked into the kitchen, gripping the edge of the counter until her knuckles turned white, fighting a sudden furious burn behind her eyes. She was an old woman who needed nothing from nobody. But as the heat poured from the stove, wrapping around her aching joints like a physical embrace, she realized how cold she had been for a very, very long time. Cans of crushed tomatoes lined the bottom shelf of the pantry, their paper labels peeling at the corners from years of trapped humidity. Mavis stared at them, calculating. 9 grown men had just burned through roughly 10,000 calories, chopping a half cord of green oak in waist-deep snow. A sleeve of crackers and a jar of peanut butter wasn't going to stop a riot. She needed mass. She needed fat. Mavis grabbed a dented aluminum stock pot from the lower cabinet, the metal scraping harshly against the wood. She hauled it to the counter, her breath hitching as a sharp twinge fired down her right sciatic nerve. She ignored it. Pain was just information, and right now the information was irrelevant. She walked past the living room doorway. The men were sprawled out, a tangle of exhausted limbs and heavy boots, basking in the aggressive heat radiating off the cast-iron stove. The cabin smelled strongly of drying, sweat-wet wool and the sharp tannic odor of split wood. Sullivan was snoring loudly, his mouth hanging open. Bear sat upright against the wall, eyes closed methodically, rubbing his thumbs over his calloused palms. Mavis bypassed them and opened the heavy weather-stripped door leading to the basement stairs. The air plunging from the dark stairwell was 20 degrees colder than the kitchen, smelling of damp earth mildew and old potatoes. She gripped the wooden handrail, testing her weight on the first step. "Ma'am?" The voice was a low rumble, gravelly and quiet. Mavis turned. A biker named Cole stood in the kitchen doorway. He was shorter than the rest, but built like a fire plug with a thick neck and a spider tattoo crawling out from the collar of his thermal shirt. "Those stairs look steep," Cole said, shifting his weight awkwardly. You need something brought up, you point. I carry. Mavis sized him up. He wasn't offering out of chivalry. He was offering because he'd seen her limp. She hated being perceived as fragile, but she also hated the idea of tumbling down 12 wooden steps and breaking her hip in front of an outlaw motorcycle gang. Root cellar is at the bottom, past the water heater, Mavis instructed, stepping back from the threshold. There's a chest freezer. Lift the lid. You'll find a plastic sack of frozen ham hocks. Bring it up and grab a burlap sack of yellow onions from the wire rack. Cole nodded once, ducking his head to clear the low door frame. He vanished into the dark stairwell, his heavy boots making the wood groan. Mavis turned back to the kitchen. She pulled an enormous scuffed wooden cutting board from behind the sink and grabbed her heaviest cleaver. By the time Cole emerged from the basement carrying the frozen meat and a 10-pound bag of onions as easily as if they were cotton balls, Mavis had the stove burners lit. "Put them on the table," she commanded. She handed Cole a paring knife. "Peel the onions, cut off the roots, toss the skins in the compost bin under the sink, not the trash. I hate when the trash smells like rot." Cole sat down at the small dinette table without a word. He looked utterly ridiculous, a hardened enforcer for the Hells Angels, sitting at a floral-patterned table peeling yellow onions with the grim focus of a man defusing a bomb. Mavis attacked the ham hocks. The meat was rock solid, rimed with white frost. She threw them into the dry stock pot, turning the heat up high to sear the fat. The kitchen quickly filled with the thick, salty smoke of rendering pork. As the meat popped and sizzled, Mavis chopped the onions Cole handed her. She worked fast, her eyes stinging and watering from the raw vapor. She scraped the massive pile of diced onions into the pot, listening to the satisfying hiss as the moisture hit the hot pork fat. "You run a tight ship," Cole muttered, wiping his eyes with the back of his massive forearm. "I run a surviving ship," Mavis corrected. She dumped 3 cans of crushed tomatoes into the pot, followed by a handful of dried oregano she'd harvested herself, crushing the leaves between her palms to release the oils. She didn't measure. Measuring was for bakers. She poured in 2 boxes of chicken broth and set the lid on the pot. "It simmers for 3 hours, Mavis announced to the empty kitchen. Cole had already retreated to the living room, escaping the onion fumes. The afternoon crawled by. The wind remained dead, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence pressed against the frosted windows. The cabin became a pressure cooker of savory smells. The rich, deep aroma of pork fat, stewed tomatoes, and sweet onions permeated every fabric in the house. It was a smell that commanded attention. It made stomachs growl audibly in the living room. When the sun finally dipped below the tree line, plunging the snow-drowned world into a bruised purple twilight, Mavis walked into the living room. "Bowls are on the counter," she said. It was a stampede. 9 massive men moved with terrifying speed, crowding into the tiny kitchen. Mavis stood back, watching them ladle the thick red stew into her mismatched ceramic bowls. They grabbed sleeves of saltine crackers, crushing them into the broth to thicken it further. They ate sitting on the floor, leaning against the wall, sitting on the hearth. There was no conversation, only the frantic scraping of metal spoons against ceramic, the loud slurping of hot broth, and the heavy, satisfied exhales of men whose bodies were finally receiving fuel. Bear finished his bowl in under 3 minutes. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and looked at Mavis, who was sitting in her chair holding a small mug of broth. "Best thing I've eaten in 10 years, Bear stated. It wasn't a compliment. It was a sworn testimony. Mavis took a sip of her broth. The pork was rich, the onions perfectly dissolved into the sauce. It's peasant food, keeps you from freezing from the inside out. "It's incredible," Toby chimed in from the rug. Color had fully returned to his face, though his knuckles were still smeared with green bag balm. Mavis didn't smile. She didn't want their praise. But as she watched them scrape their bowls clean, a strange, uncomfortable knot loosened in her chest. She had fed them. She had kept the fire burning. They were alive, and her house was intact. Tomorrow the plows would come, and they would be gone. She tried to focus on the relief of that thought, ignoring the hollow, echoing silence that would inevitably follow them out the door. Diesel engines possess a specific bone-rattling frequency. It's not just a sound, It's a physical vibration that climbs through the floorboards and settles in your teeth. Mavis felt it before she heard it. It was 7 a.m. the morning of the third day. The sky was a blinding, flawless, aggressive blue. The snowpack outside her windows glared with an intensity that demanded sunglasses. Mavis sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of instant coffee, listening. A low, mechanical growl echoed down the canyon. It grew steadily louder, accompanied by the distinct heavy scrape of a massive steel blade dragging against asphalt. In the living room, the snoring stopped abruptly. Bear was the first one up. He didn't stretch, he didn't rub his eyes. He snapped awake with the hypervigilance of a man who sleeps with one eye open. He walked to the front window, pressing his face close to the frosted glass, wiping a small circle clear with his palm. "County plow," Bear announced. His voice was thick with sleep, but the undertone of tension was unmistakable. "They're clearing Route 9. We have an out." The atmosphere in the cabin shifted instantly. The slow, lethargic energy of houseguests vanished, replaced by the sharp-coiled energy of outlaws preparing to move. Blankets were thrown off. Heavy boots were laced up with aggressive speed. Mavis watched from the kitchen doorway. She watched them put their skin back on. They retrieved their leather cuts from the pile by the front door. The leather was stiff cold and still held the faint smell of wet dog, but the moment they slipped their arms through the armholes, they transformed. The winged death's heads on their backs seemed to swell. They were no longer the men who had folded her afghans and chopped her wood. They were the Hell's Angels again. "All right, listen up," Bear barked, his voice echoing in the small room. He wasn't talking to Mavis. He was addressing his pack. "Plow is cut in the main road. Driveway is still a burial ground. We got to dig the bikes out, chip the ice off the carbs, and pray the batteries aren't dead. Grab the shovel. We work fast." They poured out the front door like a black tide. Mavis stayed inside. She walked to the window and watched them. They waded into the massive drift that swallowed her driveway. Somewhere beneath 5 feet of packed powder sat 9 heavy motorcycles. It was brutal, punishing work. The snow had settled and hardened overnight, turning into a dense crust of ice. Without enough shovels, they resorted to using pieces of split oak as scrapers, clawing at the snow with thick leather gloves. An hour passed. Then 2. Mavis busied herself in the kitchen. She washed the stew pot. She wiped down the counters. She scrubbed the stovetop until the stainless steel gleamed. She was aggressively cleaning, trying to erase the smell of 9 unwashed men from her house, but the scent of leather and stale tobacco lingered stubbornly in the curtains. Finally, a mechanical scream shattered the quiet morning. A motorcycle engine caught. It sputtered, coughed out a thick cloud of blue exhaust, and then roared to life. The sound was deafening, a violent, rattling explosion of noise that made the window panes vibrate. A cheer went up from the driveway. Over the next 30 minutes, 8 more engines joined the chorus. The air outside filled with the acrid, biting smell of raw gasoline and exhaust fumes, completely overpowering the crisp, clean scent of the pine trees. The men were revving their throttles, fighting to keep the cold engines from stalling out. Mavis put on her heavy wool coat, slipped into her rubber boots, and walked out onto the porch. The cold hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath. The driveway was a chaotic trench of jagged ice and black exhaust smoke. The 9 men were mounted on their bikes, their heavy boots planted on the cleared pavement. Bear turned his massive Harley off, kicking the stand down. He walked up the shoveled path to the porch. He stopped at the bottom of the wooden steps, looking up at Mavis. The engine noise from the other 8 bikes was a deafening roar, but Bear's presence commanded a small radius of quiet. He didn't wear a helmet. His gray beard was whipping in the wind generated by the exhaust fans. "Road is clear down to the blacktop," Bear shouted over the noise. "We're pushing out." Mavis nodded, crossing her arms over her chest to trap her body heat. "Don't hit black ice on the curves. I don't want the sheriff knocking on my door tonight asking to identify bodies." Bear cracked a smile. It was a genuine, tired smile that reached the deep crinkles around his eyes. "We'll keep it upright, ma'am." He reached into his leather vest. For a second, Mavis's pulse spiked, a lifetime of ingrained paranoia flaring up, but Bear didn't pull out a weapon. He pulled out a thick folded wad of paper. He stepped up onto the porch and held it out to her. Mavis looked at it. It was a stack of bills, hundreds, mostly crumpled, stained with grease, smelling like old wallets and gasoline. There had to be at least $2,000 there. "I don't run a hotel," Mavis said, her voice turning sharp. She didn't raise her hands to take it. "I don't want your drug money. Put it away." Bear didn't flinch. He didn't argue. He just looked at her, his dark eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. "Hey, it's not for the room," Bear said, his voice dropping an octave, forcing her to lean in slightly to hear him over the idling engines. "It's for the wood. We burned through your winter stock. You'll need to buy more, and maybe pay someone to split it next time." "I have money for wood," Mavis lied. "Take it!" Bear insisted, stepping closer. He didn't try to hand it to her again. Instead, he reached over and stuffed the thick wad of cash deep into the exterior pocket of her wool coat. He patted the pocket once, firmly. "You saved my boy's life. You fed my brothers. We square our debts." Mavis stood frozen, her hands still crossed tightly over her chest. The weight of the cash in her pocket felt heavy like a stone. Bear took a step back, tipping his head in a short, respectful nod. He turned and walked down the steps. He swung his massive leg over his bike, kicked it into gear, and twisted the throttle. The engine screamed in response. He raised his left fist in the air. The other 8 men revved their engines in unison, a terrifying, chest-thumping symphony of raw horsepower. Mavis watched from the porch as they rolled down her driveway in a tight, single-file formation. Their tires cut through the thin layer of slush, kicking up dirty water. They hit County Road 9 and turned south, accelerating hard. Within 60 seconds, the roar of the engines faded into a low hum and then completely vanished. The silence rushed back in absolute and suffocating. The snow sparkled blindly in the sun. The air smelled of exhaust, but the wind was already tearing it away. Mavis stood alone on her porch, staring at the empty, tire-scarred road. The silence was heavier than the storm had been. Inside the cabin, silence fell like a lead weight. The sudden absence of 9 massive men left a vacuum that seemed to suck the oxygen right out of Mavis's lungs. The grandfather clock in the hallway, previously drowned out by snoring and heavy boots, now ticked with the rhythmic, deafening strike of a hammer against an anvil. Mavis stood alone on her braided rug. The air still hung thick with their scent, a harsh, unapologetic blend of wet leather, wood smoke, bag balm, and stale tobacco. She reached into the deep pocket of her wool coat and pulled out the crumpled stack of bills Bear had shoved there. Her arthritic fingers unrolled the wad. They were $100 bills smeared with black engine grease and smelling sharply of gasoline. She counted them slowly, her lips moving in a silent, cynical rhythm. $3,400. Mavis scoffed, a dry, rattling sound in the empty room. It was guilt money. Blood money, maybe. She walked into the kitchen, lifted the lid off a chipped ceramic flour canister, and dropped the cash inside. She didn't want to look at it. Routine was her anchor, so she began to clean. She turned to the kitchen sink, grabbing her soapy sponge to wipe down the basin. She reached for the hot water faucet. The handle had wobbled on stripped metal threads since the winter of 2018, requiring a very specific, downward pressure to keep it from dripping endlessly. Mavis grabbed it. It didn't wobble. She frowned, twisting the knob. The water flowed smoothly. She turned it off and the flow stopped instantly. Dead silent. No drip. Mavis leaned forward, peering behind the basin. A thick piece of black rubber, clearly cut from a motorcycle inner tube, was wrapped tightly around the base of the fixture, clamped down with a heavy steel hose ring. She stared at it. A strange, tight pressure began to build at the base of her throat. She turned around. She looked at the back door. The harsh draft that usually crept under the threshold and froze her heels was gone. Nailed meticulously to the bottom of the wooden frame was a thick strip of weather-beaten black leather, cannibalized from someone's riding chaps. "Idiots," Mavis whispered to the empty room. "I didn't ask for handymen." The anger was a reflex, a familiar shield, but it felt terribly thin. She walked to the window above the sink, intending to close the curtains against the blinding sun. She looked out over the backyard. Bear and Sullivan had chopped wood yesterday. She could see the neat obsessive stack they had left against the side of the shed. She could also see the trench they had shoveled to get there. But as her eyes tracked the clean lines cut into the deep snowpack, her breath hitched. The path didn't stop at the woodshed. It continued, a straight 5-foot-deep canyon carved through the blinding white expanse of the back pasture. It bypassed the rusted tractor. It cut through the frozen briar patch. It headed directly up the gentle incline, aiming straight for the lone skeletal elm tree at the crest of the hill. Mavis gripped the edge of the sink. Her knuckles turned stark white. She knew exactly what sat under that elm tree. She didn't think. She just moved. She pulled her heavy coat back on, shoved her feet into her rubber boots, and grabbed her thick woolen gloves. She threw open the back door and stepped out into the freezing crystalline air. The cold bit into her face instantly, but she ignored it. She stepped into the trench. Walking through it was surreal. The walls of snow were packed hard, rising above her shoulders in the deepest drifts. It was a staggering amount of physical labor. Bear, Sullivan, Cole. Toby, they must have been out here hours before dawn, working in pitch blackness in sub-zero temperatures, moving tons of frozen water by hand. Mavis reached the crest of the hill, her lungs burning from the frigid air. At the top of the rise sat a small family plot, enclosed by a low wrought iron fence. For the last 3 months, the graves had been entirely swallowed by the winter invisible beneath feet of snow. Mavis hadn't been able to make the walk since October. The snow inside the iron fence was gone. The men had scraped the earth bare, tossing the white powder cleanly over the perimeter. The frozen, dormant grass was exposed, and standing stark and gray against the winter light were 4 granite headstones: her parents, her second husband, Robert, and Maggie. Mavis walked through the iron gate, the frozen earth crunching loudly under her boots. She moved toward Maggie's stone. It was smaller than the rest, heavily weathered by 40 years of mountain storms. The stone wasn't just excavated. Someone had taken a rag and wiped the frost cleanly from the carved letters. Mavis stopped at the base of the marker. Resting on top of the cold granite contrasting sharply with the gray stone was a tiny, crude carving. It was a bird whittled from a splinter of the green oak they had chopped yesterday. The wood was bright raw and smelled intensely of bitter tannin and fresh sap. Beside it, pressed onto the clean marble, was a single greasy fingerprint. Toby. "I know what death smells like," she had told him in the kitchen. She had mentioned her daughter in passing. 1 sentence. A harsh, thrown-away fact meant to shut down his gratitude. They hadn't forgotten. They hadn't offered her hollow pity or empty prayers. They had simply taken up a rusted shovel and moved a mountain so an old woman could see her child again. The iron armor Mavis had worn for decades, the cynicism, the necessary cruelty of isolation shattered. Her chest violently seized. A painful, suffocating knot tore up her throat. She tried to swallow it down, tried to clench her jaw, but the dam was utterly destroyed. Her eyes burned fiercely. The first tear spilled over a hot, stinging trail that instantly froze against her weathered cheek. She gasped a ragged, ugly sound that echoed in the dead quiet of the pasture. Mavis dropped to her knees. The cold seeped immediately through her jeans, settling deep into her aching joints. But she didn't care. She reached out with a trembling gloved hand and touched the whittled wooden bird. She bowed her head against the frozen granite, and for the first time in 20 years, Mavis cried. She wept with heavy, shaking sobs for the bitter cold, for the crushing loneliness, and for the terrifying, beautiful realization that she had been seen by men the rest of the world looked away from. That brings us to the end of Mavis and the Angels. Sometimes the most profound humanity comes wearing leather and smelling of exhaust. If this raw story of unlikely grace in the freezing snow hit you right in the chest, drop a like on this video right now. It helps push these gritty, real narratives to people who need a reminder not to judge a book by its cover. Share this with someone who needs a good cry today. And make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another unbelievable story.